Thank you, Stephanie. Hey, everybody, my name is Susan Stapleton, and I'll thank you again for joining the webinar. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick introduction of our speakers. We have Chris Rutkowski from SAP. Chris is the Senior Director of Solution Management there for the GRC Solutions. And John Scaramucci is here from Protiviti. John is the Associate Director in the Business Applications Practice. So Protiviti has been instrumental in helping us, I'm going to say us, meaning SAP and Pathlock, in rolling out a lot of GRC solutions at a lot of different customers. And so what we're going to do today is Chris is going to do a quick kickoff and introduction of the topic. John's going to pick up, well, I guess I'll pick up and talk to a couple of slides. Then John will come in and give us some very specific information about how a customer did revolutionize their SOD risk management. And then we'll come back and do a quick wrap and open it up for questions. But I do want to thank you. We're going to really focus on segregation of duties in that complete end-to-end user access governance process, how to identify risk in and across systems, but really focusing on how to automate the mitigation, kind of a gap that a lot of customers currently still have today. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris. He's going to take the next few minutes to talk about this, and then I'll pick it up, and then we'll come in. So Chris, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
And thank you, Susan. And welcome to the session, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. What we're looking at here is basically the solution components or the main functional elements of an SAP Access Governance solution. And what this is really showing you is all the different ways you can either prevent or detect segregation of duties or access risks from occurring in your systems. And why is this so important? Because segregation of duties essentially is the connection or the context between maybe a standard identity management or assignment process and your business processes. And this represents, key capabilities in your systems that, should you assign them to someone, could put your company's financial, reporting results at risk, could introduce fraud or misuse or mistakes into your key business processes. We're talking about things like making payments, hiring people, receiving goods, all the things that are essentially running or even in some cases can define your business. So hopefully most of this is familiar to you. Early days when we were first installing access control, we were having customers that had essentially no controls over their SOD risks running this for a long time. They would find hundreds of millions or even trillions of potential SOD risks. And so the mitigation process is really a key thing. And so we think about all the different permutations and combinations that can occur and the structures that you can use to assign users that access. Firstly, you want to be able to analyze the risk. So there's the first step is sort of checking to see what risks might occur by looking at all the different assignments in your systems and cross-correlating that with your rule set. You want to incorporate that process when you manage access. So this is when somebody is requesting a role, or when there's an automated event that might be associated with a hiring or change or even termination event in your HR system. You want to make sure that the access risk is checked and potentially mitigated at that point. You can also introduce SOD risks in your role definitions, and that could be a business role, even an SAP technical role. So you want to make sure that you have the ability to check your SOD risks at that level. You want to be able to periodically check to see whether assignments that your users currently have are consistent with their particular job function in your organization. So you want to run certification campaigns to certify that those assignments are correct. And part of that is also certifying or reviewing users that may have to live with certain types of SOD risks. And finally, in order to handle exceptional cases, you have the ability to monitor and have a process in place for emergency access. Okay, Susan, I think we can go on to the next slide. So you can have these processes in place, and so you're both checking, any kind of event or activity that could result in an SOD being introduced in a business role. That would result in everyone having that risk who were assigned that business role. And then you can introduce risks in a variety of other ways. And the important thing to consider is this is not a static process. User access is always changing. New users are coming on. Users are changing their jobs or getting different responsibilities in your organization. So you gotta have a process in place to do a number of things. One is if you do have to live with an SOD, you got to have some kind of mitigation process to ensure that the user gets the right level of authorization in the system, and or you need to have a process of assigning a mitigating control. Part of this is being able to report to your auditors that you have control and management over this process. So you got to be able to provide reports. One of the worst things that I've seen happen within a company is you uncover some kind of material deficiency, and often that's related to some kind of SOD issue. So you really want to prevent that from happening. Now, mitigating controls are not necessarily perfect if they're not performed properly. So sometimes you're relying on people to perform those mitigating controls. And you have, like I said, a dynamic environment where there's organizational turnover and competing priorities and other things that you just have to live with your SODs. And one thing that SAP does is that the SOD is kind of a flat number, meaning the impact of that SOD is not made clear in the reporting itself. So you need to have an understanding of what financial process could be affected in order to really understand what the impact is. If there's a financial impact, what is the magnitude of that impact? So it's critical that you are able to prioritize your activities around creating mitigating controls, remediating risks, changing user assignments in order to make use of best use of the process. All right, next slide. Okay, so the point of this, firstly, the system will provide you a lot of detail about the roles that may contain SOD violations, the users that have SOD violations, but what you really want to do is understand what the real exceptions are. And so the real exceptions are, cases where maybe somebody executed both sides of a function. Maybe there could be a risk there. How many times did they do that? How often, how frequently was that activity being performed? In the absence of, good data, you may not know what the sort of financial risk is, or at least it may not be easily transparent. So really need a mechanism to kind of understand and prioritize, what is the financial impact? What's in terms of quantifying what that financial impact is, so you can take the appropriate action. All right, Susan, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Chris. So just to kind of pick up on this a little bit before I move on, there are a lot of different ways to do controls. And I think if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, access control can tell you who has access to the system. It can tell you your roles with violations. It can tell your users with SOD violations. And it can go a level between real exceptions and SOD violations. And that's the usage data, right? Who did get into transactions. But that real exception, that last circle, is where it's really important to identify when someone created a vendor, paid that same vendor, how much was that payment, and really, focus in on the exposure the company has, because someone has SOD access and they're processing SOD transactions. I want to say one more thing about the control side of the house. And I'm going to stay here on this slide for a second. There are a lot of controls that can be put in place from a mitigation perspective. There can be key controls that are assigned that allow you to monitor vendor invoices and vendors and payments and different things like that. So a lot of customers assign key controls where they're looking at, very siloed activities, transactions, master data, and so on. You can assign access to a firefighter ID to remove the SOD, but that is not a control. And that is really just masking the SOD, because the user is still able to do both functions. It might just be under different IDs. That is not a control either. And it still kind of blows my mind today how many companies I talk to where their control that's documented is just that we're going to accept this risk because the users have to have this access. And that is really not a good control. So we've always preached, I think I can say that for everybody on this call that is presenting today, that you need to kind of have an approach of get clean and stay clean. And customers have been able to use access control to identify those millions, trillions of SOD risk and slowly whittle those away by role redesigns, removing access from users, potentially changing a business process. I mean, it really is trying to get to that steady state of these are my users that will have SOD risks. And even if I do role redesigns, I mean, the potential is there's still going to be risks that are, it's not the potential. The reality is that role redesigns can only get you so far. And then, you know, the stay clean model is typically still around SAP. Identify the risk, remediate the risk, identify your controls. But part of the stay clean process we're going to be focusing in on today is that when those risks are known, we can pick those up and start monitoring those users to provide the mitigation control, completely automated. And that is by not looking at all of these systems based on what users can do, but looking at these systems and focusing on posted transactional events and correlating them back to the user. So you can really focus on the steady state, but you know, providing controls as the last piece of that user access management process. There are thousands of access control customers out there, and I think, you know, you're probably connected to one or more SAP systems if you're using access control. And as you migrate to SAP, or I'm sorry, to S4, you're probably going to be adopting cloud solutions. So one of the things that we do to help customers is to bring those applications into access control so that your access governance solution can now incorporate all of your risky applications across the enterprise. You're going to be moving procurement to a cloud solution potentially, inventory to a best of breed inventory management solution, or it might even be, you know, SAP Enterprise Warehouse Management, or it could be, you know, you're moving your billing or invoicing to a cloud solution. We're seeing that kind of across the board as customers are adopting S4. We can now give you that risk review of who could do what in and across any of the systems that are connected to access control. And you continue leveraging your access control solution, your workflows, your provisioning, your deprovisioning, your HR triggers, all of that stuff you've got in place to manage SAP with AVM, with access control. We can just incorporate more and more systems, and that is still your single source of truth for your auditors. And then when it comes into bringing the next piece of access violation management in, that's really picking up and monitoring risk in and across systems now. Who created the purchase order in Coupa? Who approved that purchase order in Coupa? Who received the goods into SAP? What are those transactions and so on? We can put a lot of filtering on top of that data so that by the time it gets to the business owner, it is material risk, meaning it's something they need to review and sign off on. And this is, you know, a key factor in having the business to adopt the risk and the monitoring of the risk that are happening in their business applications. I can't stress that enough. Part of maturing through user access governance is really focusing on moving this monitoring and the control activities out to the business who knows who the users are, what they should be doing, and the transactions that are appropriate in their business applications. We talk about this slide a lot. The potential risk is what you identify in access control. How many users can create a vendor and process vendor invoices? How many users can create purchase orders and process payments? That is all of that can do. Who can do these activities in and across the business applications that I'm monitoring for segregation of duties? But with something like access violation management, it really is built for the risk management side of the house, and it's picking up those users and identifying by looking at 100% of the transactions when the same user did create a vendor and process an invoice to the same vendor, and that it's over a certain dollar amount, or that they changed a, you know, critical field on the vendor master data, not just a phone number. I mean, really, really keying in on what we want the business to review and sign off on. And we can quantify that, which is something that is extremely valuable to a company, not just monitoring how many users can do something, but what happened and what's the value of those associated transactions. And it doesn't mean that this is fraud, but it does mean when you drill in at this level that you can identify fraudulent activity much faster than a manual control, and absolutely faster than a non-existent control. So I'm going to stop here and let John talk a little bit more about this piece and also our customer use case that we're going to dive into.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, I love this slide. I really love the little pop outs on the right there and at the bottom, because when we work with our clients, this is the kind of data that we really like to dig into and try to get that real picture of, right? Because the did do exceptions here are what actually represents the risk to all these companies. So when we look at these examples, like you see a ton of data, a ton of numbers. It's very alarming on the left. But when we dig into the real risk, there still could be a high dollar amount, but sometimes it's much fewer users or exceptions that constitute that, and it's a much less scary thing to try to mitigate and review and investigate. So when you look at like the top line, only 4 users, right, out of 208 actually did this, or the next one down, it's the smallest amount of SOD conflict, but it actually was the largest dollar amount. So kind of going in the other direction, just looking at the can do picture doesn't really tell you a whole lot about how much risk you really have until you start quantifying these things. And of course, the one I love at the bottom is just, you have all this access risk out there, but nobody actually executed on it. So, it's something we can go to bed a little bit easier about. And hopefully, if we implement a solution, like AVM or just an investigative process like this, you can avoid wasting time, looking for these kind of exceptions. So yeah, this next slide, I want to pause too and introduce myself again. Again, John Scaramucci. I work with Protiviti in our enterprise application solutions. I've been working in the SAP security space for over 12 years. But the stuff that I really like to do is what we're talking about right now, and been working with Pathlock for a long time, and helping our clients digest this kind of data out of access control, out of their SAP and other SAP non-SAP applications, and understanding what to do with it is really where I like to spend a lot of my time, as much of my time as I can, I guess. So leveraging these results to drive action, right? This is what we often find our clients need the most help with, is not just getting the data, but figuring out what to do with it once we have it. So just to kind of high level talk through this process, right? The first step is identifying what risks your system really has, right? So it's not just a matter of running a tool and seeing what results come out, but actually having a thoughtful discussion with your business owners and with your key stakeholders about which risks actually apply to the business and your different applications, and then measuring that with access control or some approach to understand where the potential access risk exists, and then diving into the ones that you want to get some better understanding of from a financial perspective and a true risk exposure perspective. And then once you do have that data, figuring out a process for distributing it. So understanding what the data is, what types of transactions are these, who should they be delivered to, and who should we request to investigate this, so that that process needs to be handled thoughtfully, and you need to give people time and direction on how to interpret the data. But what this does effectively is help transfer this mitigation process and this ownership over SOD and system access risk to the business, where you can really drive an intelligent analysis of whether or not this access is needed, and help to create more incentive to tighten up your security and reduce the amount of risk that you have in the landscape overall. Because when you start looking at these actual exceptions, you can really visualize where the exposure is and look at not just a total dollar amount, but also detailed line item exceptions. So driving down to the line item level and understanding, okay, this is actually what happened here with this access. Maybe this is something that needs to persist, and we can capture all the transactions that occur here, or maybe we know there's other mitigating activities that are performed or circumstances that we can incorporate into this process. So you can get smarter as you iterate this process and apply rules to your reporting and filters to be able to, continue to fine tune the type of exceptions that are reported out to your business reviewers. So everyone can kind of get involved in fine tuning this process, and improving the access governance management strategy throughout the whole organization. So what we want to spend a good amount of time here talking about today is a particular client of ours that we helped implement AVM, and help them with other access governance processes. But basically their journey from how they were managing SOD before to how they're doing it now to where they're going in the future. This slide kind of lays out their overall roadmap, kind of from the early stages with the AVM risk assessment module being incorporated. So this company initially did a proof of concept of AVM back in 2017, and when it was decided to go forward with that, took some time to update their SOD rule set. So this was something that several parties were involved with to make sure the right risks were involved and the right technical detail was included. And we'll take a little deeper dive on those activities in a minute here. And then once the AVM rollout started, it was done over a period of about a year and a half, where we initially focused on a subset of SAP risks, rolled them out, sort of piloted the process, the control review process to occur in AVM for a limited scope, and then rolled out the rest of the SAP scope at the end of the year, and then turned our attention to some of their non-SAP applications and cross-system scenarios to monitor those types of exceptions as well. And in the future, this company is planning to upgrade to the latest version of AVM, as well as harmonize their various rule sets across the enterprise as they embark on a digitalization effort, implementing S/4HANA and continuing to transform and modernize and update these processes and applications as they go along. So this, I want to take a minute and pause and talk about really the backbone of this whole process, SOD, not just the transaction monitoring that we're talking about with quantifying risk, but also your access monitoring with access control and SOD reports. It's all based on the rule set that you're using. So taking the time to properly develop a applicable rule set for your organization is not something where you can just take an out of the box starting point and go forward with it. You really need to spend the time to work with your different business owners and stakeholders to understand what's applicable. So what this company's done and continues to do is to refine the SOD rule set based on a variety of starting points. So most recently this is based on a legacy set of risks that were being used for legacy applications, as well as input from their external audit and consulting partners. Protiviti has a leading that we use as kind of a starting point, but it's a big library from kind of everything we've seen, and all these things put together gives us a pretty good starting point. But it's still then a matter of going through and holding workshops and talking to a lot of people within the company and understanding the processes and the functionality that's being used, and understanding which risks are not just applicable, but also what level of criticality are they to the business. So we typically use a risk framework ranking of high, medium, low, critical, those sorts of things, like a medium being something that's represents an operational risk but might not be financially relevant, and high risk being something that can really impact the financials if this particular risk scenario is carried out. And then you can use other things to optimize a little bit more. So you can monitor low risks that is something you want to segregate, but it's not really going to cause impact to the company if something is carried out, but you do want to separate these responsibilities. You can monitor low risks. You can elevate some things to critical if you want to have a different approach to how you mitigate the SOD or manage the SODs as they occur. So we've seen some clients use the the critical rating, where when access request comes in, if it is going to represent, if it's going to trigger a critical risk, you just immediately deny the request and work through that a different way. Where high risks, you can potentially accept them as long as there's a mitigating control available and applied when that provisioning happens. So those are the kind of things that you lean on as you go through these risk layer workshops and design your rule set from the risk universe perspective. And then of course the attention shifts to the technical layer, and this is very important to get right, because a lot of your reporting is based on these configurations, and you have to know what T codes, Fiori apps, and customizations have been deployed in the environment, and build them into the appropriate functions in the rule set. So this is something that often requires a very firm handshake between your development, your GRC team, your security team, all these different parties, so that anytime any customization or new functionality is introduced, that it's placed in the appropriate function in the rule set, and then the impact to the environment is, should be considered as well, right? If it's new functionality, we might have to have some more workshops and identify the appropriate risks. If it's a new custom way of doing something, that needs to go in the right function in the rule set, right? If we develop a custom transaction that lets us post vendor invoices, that needs to get put in the vendor invoice function, or functions, depending on how you've refined your different risk scenarios. So technical layer, crucial to have the right people involved in that step of the way. And then moving forward into actually deploying the rule set, right? We need to run some risk analysis with the rule set after it's been loaded into an access control solution, and understand how this is going to impact the security that's either being built, if this is being done in parallel with a S4 or SAP implementation, right? We can run these sorts of checks against our rule set while we're rolling out the new security, and that's obviously the best practice scenario, is kind of design in our SOD free security role design as you're deploying this leading practice rule set. But in the event that you can't avoid having some SODs at go live, or if you're doing this after go live and cleaning things up, also identifying which risks are going to remain, and what mitigating controls we can apply to monitor the activity that's being performed with that access. And then of course an ongoing process of managing this. So all the the steps along the way kind of need to be refreshed and continue to manage this. A rule set is not sort of a let's do this one time and deploy it type of activity. It's really a living, breathing document and tool that your company manages kind of forever. As long as you have applications and have access risk in those applications, you need this rule set, this type of approach to monitoring the risk in your environment. So in this company scenario, they have an SOD governance committee that stays informed on any changes to the environments that might affect the rule set, and any status changes that are requested to different risks or things like that, all funneled through this SOD governance committee. So yeah, that's a bit of maybe a sidebar here about the rule set, but this really is the backbone and a critical piece to all these other activities being successful. So you want to make sure you have a solid rule set that's been socialized, that has good leadership support, and in here before we move forward. So getting back to this, the specific scenario here with this client that we helped, their controls, there's two key controls that manage SOD, and there's two very important parties that are responsible for carrying out these controls. So the first being the different business managers within the organization, and obviously this is a wide-ranging group of individuals, but we're talking about hundreds, close to 1,000 different managers throughout the enterprise, that oversee groups of users, and this could be any business segment, business process. This is IT or finance, anyone out in the business. But their role when it comes to this SOD control process is to understand what the different conflicts are and how to articulate why their different users need to have this access, and so that when the SOD review process is initiated, that they can respond and understand what they're being asked, and make a decision as to whether or not their users need to retain the access. And on the other side, on the far right, you have a compliance team that's made up of less than 10 people. It's a smaller group, but very focused on internal controls and compliance. And from an SOD perspective, they also understand the different types of conflicts that are out there. They'll help the managers identify controls if they need, and they may actually, in some cases, run the reports that either identify the conflicts out of like a GRC access control, or help put together some of the data that's used to understand what's actually happened as a result of the SOD. So in the middle there is kind of the shared responsibility. So both of these groups of individuals are kind of responsible for making sure that mitigating control reports are reviewed and that the controls are carried out, and that the evidence of all this activity is retained. And they also, they need to know if the particular business manager that oversees an individual, is not able to carry out a control, whether they're going to be out during the review period, or it's not part of their, particular job responsibility in a unique scenario. They need to know who actually is responsible for carrying that out. So, there's a good amount of responsibility already, pushed out to the business for this particular company. I would say they are pretty advanced on the maturity curve, even before AVM was brought into the picture. And that's why this was an example of really revolutionizing their processes and getting them to the next level. If you go to the next slide, it sort of articulates what the actual steps are in their SOD control. So they initially run an SOD report on their using their access control solution, and send that out to all those managers for review. And they determine whether or not they're going to, remove or retain the conflicting access. And that's facilitated by access control using some of the AVM integration solutions for their non-SAP applications as well. And again, that's just the access-based step. So the next step here on the right side is the look-back control. So this is sort of mitigating, what's happened as a result of that SOD access. And they retain all the evidence of the review of the controls of the transactions that were identified as being an SOD conflict. And this is all facilitated by the AVM RA solution. Now, if we go into the next slide here, this is actually the results of a survey that was performed, sort of demonstrating the improvement that was achieved using AVM instead of the sort of prior approach. So, all those activities, they didn't change all that much, but they, were carried out in a more manual fashion, using lots of spreadsheets, reports being pulled by a variety of individuals. So you had, IT helping with some reports, you had the compliance team helping with some reports, some business managers, pulled their own reports to show evidence when they performed that look back side of the control. But now, with AVM, everything is standardized. It's all an automated solution that goes out for each of these SODs. It has a defined set of criteria to generate these exceptions, and brings it all into one central place so now the external audit, teams can go to a one-stop shop to get all the evidence of the review that was performed and the actual transactions that occurred, all in one place. So it obviously has significant, time saving for the control owners, the business managers, to complete their review, because they don't have to go, to multiple places. There's one place to log in, and all the results are, right there in their inbox. Significant preference. You see at the bottom some of these statistics, significant preference towards using the centralized tool, which is kind of self-explanatory. But also the reduction on the internal controls and compliance teams to oversee this process and help the managers through it, for external audit to perform their review and test this process. Centralizing it has inherent benefits, as well as tertiary things like just standardizing this process allows it to be much more scalable. So as a business like this grows and continues to expand and have turnover within their organization, this process is highly transferable, and so it's really revolutionized them from a pretty mature model, from SOD management perspective to really as good as you can get. So that is the story here. And Susan, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, and I want to say just a couple of things also, I guess, before I move on here. There are all levels of maturity. And the first thing I want to say, and I think we could probably talk about this topic for hours, is I agree with John. Your rule set is everything. And sometimes we come in and start automating controls for risks that aren't even risks any longer. But the rule set hasn't been up to date or updated. So we're trying to automate a control and we find 0 transactions occurring. That has happened. So I just want to say that is the backbone of everything. And I'm just going to back John up on that topic. And it, while this is a very mature customer, and we've done this with a lot of mature customers, there still is just a tremendous amount of resources that are required. And one of our customers in Europe used to say it takes a village to do this process, because they did exactly the same thing. They had business ownership. They did a lot of pulling down of data, correlating it. By the time it gets to the reviewer, it is filtered down somewhat. But that is weeks, if not months, of activity to get prepped to do that segregation of duty mitigation process. And by then, it's a lot of stale data. So being able to do this more real time, more often, push out what you need to push out. For mature customers, it's a no-brainer because they know how much activity is involved in doing this manually. For customers who are starting out, it's a good way to automate the process from the get-go and get the business involved, because you are making it easy enough for the business users and facilitating that. But even if you can't get to that step immediately, one of the things you can do is go ahead and run these reports. John talked about this as well. Look at this data internally before you start rolling it out, making sure the data coming out is appropriate, that you're not getting 1,000 transactions under $5 that no one cares about. Really fine tune all of those reports. So by the time you do start sending out things to the business, they will absolutely depend on this and understand that this is good data, no false positives, things that they can action and should be actioning because it's meaningful to them, or material from a financial perspective. I'm going to go through just a couple of slides here to wrap up, but access control has been a long time GRC solution for many, many, many SAP customers. But your activities are going to start moving outside of SAP, but your risks do not go away. In fact, the majority of customers still monitor the exact same risks. It's just that with access control, we now monitor who can maintain a sales document in Salesforce, who is receiving invoices or receiving goods to a purchase order in a warehouse management application. And all of that can be done in your existing access control solution by just real-time integration to these other applications. It's just SOD and very granular SOD reporting. And that is in access control. And then you get to where you have risks that have been identified. Now those risks may cross multiple business applications. And in access control, this is where you would go document how you would manually control that risk. Run report A, run report B, correlate data, prove that I did it, make sure that the data was complete, upload my proof to SharePoint. It's a very, very manual activity when you're monitoring and managing SOD risks in a non-automated way. And what John is talking about when we talk about revolutionizing mitigation or management of risk, it's by going through and identifying transactions that have been posted, correlating them back to the same user who processed both sides of the SOD conflict. The same user received goods into the warehouse, and they also paid or entered the invoice for those same goods. And that data is all correlated into one line of a work list. This is a manager and to John's point, you know, providing an email notification to the user's manager saying there are SOD conflicts to review, along with instructions. Here's what you need to do. You need to go to this link. You need to review these data. You need to upload this document. You need to prove, you know, that you reviewed this and move these to a closed status. I mean, a lot of that is how you can facilitate movement of the reviewers, whether it's the user manager. If it's a risk owner, it might be a little bit of a different instruction that you would put in that email notification. But again, they would come in here, review these, move them from an open to a closed status. That removes them from the work list. But behind the scenes, all of this data is being correlated into dashboards. So you can monitor the risk month over month, quarter over quarter. While these are kind of real-time controls, our customers schedule them to run once a week, once a month, or once a quarter. That's when the email gets pushed out. And those get reviewed and then again correlated up here because these are posted transactions. There is a dollar value associated with scrapped material, with asset depreciation, with goods receipt into the warehouse, with a sales order that's been delivered. All of those things have a financial component, and that's how we monitor actual SOD violations. And I want to say, you know, our goal here is to prevent and identify or detect fraud quickly, because segregating duties is one of the best controls you can have. But if you cannot do that, you need to have a comprehensive control in place. But in fact, this is really just managing those risks by monitoring 100% of the transactions in the business applications and providing a detective control so that you can pass your audits. And one other thing I want to say about resources. It's not only the resources to prep for audit and perform controls. Customers spend a lot of resource time helping to support the audit, helping to pull, helping to identify or pull proof or audit records or things like that. So there's time savings across the board here. And final wrap-up slide. I mean, I think it's important as your business is transforming with S4 that you look at your overall access governance processes and think about, as you're adopting cloud solutions, as you're continuing to have more and more complex process controls and activities that cross multiple applications, you know, look at how you can automate as much as possible and transform your access governance pieces as well. Make sure that you are not ignoring applications like Workday, like Coupa, when you're doing your SODs. That is going to start causing multiple issues when it comes to audit. And a lot of those cloud solutions, you can do a single system SOD report within Coupa, within Workday. But what you're not seeing is what that user can also do in S4 or another solution, and the risk associated with having access to multiple systems. I want to say, you know, I said this before, but as you mature through this process, it's going to be very important to start pushing things out and have business ownership. And this automation and making this as easy as to do as possible, only putting up things that need review, and a business owner might not even get an email notification at a certain quarter if there were no SOD actions or activities for them to review. And another thing, you know, role redesigns, they're very important and they are necessary a lot of times, but it is never going to clean up all of your risks, and it can reduce risk by 20–30%, but you're still going to have risk to mitigate. And really, that's just within SAP. You start thinking about crossing multiple applications, making sure roles are clean across multiple applications, can be combined across multiple applications. That's the access side of the house. The mitigation just becomes more and more complex as you introduce more and more systems. All right, well, I'm going to stop there. I think we did pretty good at hitting our 45 minutes, but let's open it up for questions. Stephanie's going to moderate the Q&A, but just once again, I want to thank John and Chris for presenting with me today. And yeah, let's open it up for questions.
Thank you, Susan, John, and Chris, for your presentation. We do have questions that have come in. Our first question is there a formula to calculate the dollar amount?
There is a formula to calculate the dollar amount, and it's a certain field that we capture, and it depends on what the transaction is. And we also convert all back to a normalized currency if you're a global corporation. But yeah, I mean, if it's a payment, we pull the actual payment number of what the amount of that payment, and that's the exposure for that particular SOD activity. I don't know, John, if you want to say anything more about that, but we just strictly pull the posted amount from the business application, whatever that may be.
No, I think that covers it. You know, and there's different ways to look at the total dollar amount as well, right? It could be based on a, you know, particular organizational value, right? So if it's like all within one company code or within one plant, or you could look at it by a specific user or specific, you know, vendor, or, you know, total overall, you know, across risks, across business processes. So, you know, it's not that there's one field, right, for each type of transaction that represents the amount, but then how you total that for quantifying everything kind of depends on, you know, which way you want to look at it.
Okay. Thanks.
Perfect. The next question is, are there any use cases or pointers to predict when a did do TXN can happen in the future?
Good question. Right now, I think you're looking for predictive analysis. That is not in AVM today. I think that's something that definitely could be looked at, maybe already looked at, but no, we're not predicting. It's not a predictive solution yet.
I mean, if the assignment exists and enables somebody to actually do those functions or transactions, then, you know, then you'd have a good case for being able to predict that, you know, some level of possibility. It could be that those are certain transactions that have to be executed during certain time periods, maybe blackout dates and so forth. So I don't know, maybe there's some way to put some AI or some intelligence behind it, but you know, I think it's something we're thinking about, but haven't really implemented in terms of solutions.
Yeah, and I would add, you know, from a, you know, more crude perspective, but as you have the, like, as you continue to have this data, and it's a really powerful tool, right, that gives you this type of data. If you have an SOD risk that you're monitoring, that people have access to, and there's not a lot of activity behind it, you know, that should trigger two things. One, let's make sure that we are incorporating all the right, you know, elements in the rule set and in the monitoring control, that we really would be capturing everything, right? So you can always like refresh that and make sure that that's accurate. But if you could prove that there really just aren't a lot of things happening, and it represents, you know, a significant potential risk, you know, that's an incentive to remove the access. So, you know, although you can't predict, it's not exactly prediction, but there are ways to, you know, impacts you can have even when there aren't transactions occurring and activities that should trigger.
Okay, great. The next question we have is GRC access control a necessary prerequisite to use AVM?
It is not. The majority of all of our customers do have SAP access control, but there are a couple that are using a different GRC solution, but they still use AVM to do the mitigation. Access control is a requirement to use our integrations to other systems, because we're integrating those systems to access control. That's specifically what that integration was built for. So AVM has two components. AVM system integration is one product you can buy. AVM risk assessment is another. And you do not need access control to buy AVM risk assessment, which is the automated monitoring or the automated mitigation.
Okay, perfect. The next question is, does this require an add-on component in target system?
Sometimes. So if the target system is another ERP like PeopleSoft or Oracle eBusiness or, you know, an on-prem Dynamics, something like that, there is typically an add-on that will go in that. But if we're connecting to a cloud system, we do not put an add-on in any of those cloud applications. We're using APIs and web services.
Okay, great. We just have a few more questions. In this quantification, is quantification only possible in dollar amount, or are there other ways the solution supports to quantify risk?
Right now, we're quantifying by dollar values. I'm not sure to quantify risk, so operational risk or something like that. But to me, the quantification specifically is around the dollar value of the transaction. I don't know if someone wants to type in the chat what a different type of control is, or maybe Chris or John know. But our quantification right now is, I mean, number of risks that occurred, dollar value associated with those risks, you know, summarized up into dashboards.
Yeah, like number of exceptions and number of users and things like that are included. There are some risks that don't really have a financial impact that can be monitored. So some of those you're only looking at when we say quantification, you're really just looking at the number of occurrences.
Yeah.
I am curious if there's something else you're thinking of here.
I mean, if you look at the term risk, I mean, it could be that, could be the questions related to sort of, reputation loss or, damage to brand or, risk of, being non-compliant or, risk of fines or penalties, things like that, which are, maybe not a direct, well, I mean, most of that can be tied to a number, I would say, but often, maybe it's calculated differently. I'm not sure if that's the question, but certainly there are other dimensions of security, compliance, business operations, brand value, things like that, that all could be impacted by, a case of fraud, for example. So I would say you just factor those into your overall sort of enterprise risk strategy.
Yep.
Okay, and then looks like we have one more question. Is AVM just for SOD risks or other type of risks too?
It's really, AVM risk assessment is kind of meant to fill the gap that process control does business process risk, IT general controls, and so on. It really is built to create user access or manage user access risk. So that's critical actions and SODs.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's all the questions we have for today. So I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and thank Susan, John, and Chris for presenting today. If you do have any more questions, you can reach out to any of the presenters here. Their email addresses are listed, or you can reach out to us at info@pathlock.com, and we would be happy to answer any of your questions or demo any of the things that you have any questions on. So with that, I just want to say thank you for coming, and we hope to see you at future events.